Hello, welcome to aniplane. It is a third part of I Became a Part-Time Employee for Gods, and the link of part 1, 2 and 3 is in description or comment box. Let's begin. The protagonist was shocked upon reading the pet precaution. He screamed, accusing Hades of wanting to kill him, for Stephanie urged him to check the daily schedule on the back of the page. Upon seeing that he was only asked to feed Cerberus, the protagonist tore up the paper in anger. However, Persephone warned him that the previous part-timer, who had tried to back out, had been caught by her husband and dragged to hell where his limbs were torn apart. Frightened by the warning, the protagonist quickly glued the paper back together and asked Persephone where to start. She instructed him to feed Cerberus, and showed him the meat carried by the nymphs. As the protagonist prepared to throw the meat, Cerberus growled excitedly, making the protagonist wonder if he turned into a dog in front of food. For Stephanie suddenly burst into laughter as the protagonist got covered in dirt. She referred to him as an interesting part-timer and explained that there was no need to train Cerberus since the hound only obeyed her husband. This realization made the protagonist understand why no one had applied for the job in the first place. Annoyed, he threw meat at one of the heads of Cerberus, which made the other two heads laugh. He then threw meat at the other two heads as well, further escalating his irritation. The protagonist was greatly annoyed by this and suddenly attacked by Cerberus, but the chains that bound them prevented him from getting close. The protagonist laughed and mocked Cerberus, which only made him angrier in the process. He broke the chains, which shocked Persephone. Suddenly the protagonist was attacked, but he managed to dodge it. Persephone was amazed at how the chains had broken, but the protagonist told her it wasn't the right time to talk about it. He grabbed her hand and ran away, for Stephanie was shocked to see a wound on the protagonist's arm, but he assured her that it was just a graze. He continued to lament about how easily the chains had broken, but Persephone explained that it was her first time seeing it happen. The protagonist implores Persephone to flee, but she refuses and urges him to stay close to her. She explains that as the wife of the underworld's owner, Cerberus will not attack them if they are together. However, to their surprise, Cerberus attacks them anyway. The protagonist shoves Persephone aside and casts out to snow, using her as a weapon to strike Cerberus, but it has little effect. As a result, the protagonist is left vulnerable to attack and wonders why Cerberus is so powerful. As Cerberus approaches, Persephone warns the protagonist not to go near the river Styx, as the creatures there will immediately devour him. However, the protagonist's mind is foggy and he fails to heed her advice. Persephone realizes that the protagonist is not listening and commands Cerberus to stop, but he disobeys and continues towards the protagonist, fearing he will become dog food. The protagonist rejects this fate, leaps into the river Styx, shocking Persephone, who calls out his name. As the protagonist drowns, he realizes his helplessness and contemplates whether he is dying. He experiences a sensation of floating in a dream and starts to question the validity of his past experiences, including his part-time job. In his entire life, he recalls many things he wished to buy from a god shop but could not. His memories seem to detach from his body and he begins to have flashbacks before his death, despite urging Snow White. Believe him. She swims down and bites his nose, causing him to scream in pain and snap out of the illusion. As something grabs his neck, he struggles to identify it while his consciousness gradually fades away. Desperate for a solution, he transforms Snow White into a giant hammer and uses the dwarf hammer skill to create distance between himself and the unknown entity. The protagonist realized he couldn't breathe and quickly swam up to the surface with Snow White, grateful to have come back from the brink of death. Suddenly, Cerberus attacked him and bit him, but luckily a notification appeared indicating that the Styx water effect would last for an hour, rendering the protagonist immune to poison ailments, stuns, bleeds, and physical attacks. The protagonist remembered the legend of Thetis, who made her son invincible by dipping him in the river of Styx except for his heels, which became his fatal weakness, later known as Achilles' heel. As the protagonist realized he was completely soaked in Styx water, making him invincible, Persephone appeared in shock and attempted to pull him in snow. Laid out. Upon seeing them covered in Styx water, she called them filthy. The protagonist questioned her use of the word and she quickly apologized and asked if he was okay. She then inquired about how he was able to survive entering the Styx river, to which the protagonist was also unsure. Suddenly Cerberus attacked again and bit the protagonist's hands, but the protagonist was unbothered and even yawned, asking if Cerberus was done for. Stephanie was astonished that a low-ranked god could survive being bitten by Cerberus, and wondered if it was a blessing of immortality. The protagonist, looking quite cool, informed Cerberus that he had been given food but had not eaten it, and then asked if they could go for a walk, calling Cerberus. Cerberus appeared visibly annoyed, prompting the protagonist to inform him that he wouldn't be taken out for a walk if he kept acting that way. This caused Cerberus to retreat, and the protagonist was pleased to have learned a trick like that while working at a pet shop. However, the protagonist was shocked when Cerberus returned with broken chains in his mouth. The protagonist fixed the chains, but was interrupted by Persephone, who advised him to take it easy since Cerberus hadn't gone for a walk in a long time despite her concerns. The protagonist assured her that he had everything under control, only to be stunned when Cerberus dragged him away. As Cerberus dragged the protagonist, a skill suddenly activated that increased the wind's speed. Persephone called out to the protagonist and urged him to use his divine power to strengthen his body. Although the protagonist was confused, Persephone insisted that Cerberus was too powerful and he needed to tap into his divine power. This came as a great shock to the protagonist, since he thought divine power wasn't a type of stat. When Persephone asked him if he knew how to use it, he admitted that he didn't know, which greatly surprised her, for Stephanie encouraged the protagonist to remember the feeling of using his power, and suggested that he imagined controlling the water inside his body. Following her instructions, the protagonist tapped into his divine power and stopped. Cerberus, for Stephanie, then urged him to focus his strength on the specific part of his body he wanted to strengthen. The protagonist did just that and swung Cerberus into the air, shocking Persephone. He then smashed Cerberus to the ground successfully, using his divine power to defeat him. Despite the protagonist's decision to end their work in return, Cerberus refused to comply. As a result, the protagonist began dragging Cerberus, causing Persephone to be shocked. She was amazed that even though it was the protagonist's first time using his power, he was able to accomplish so much, calling him a great part-timer. The protagonist thought to himself that Persephone was strong and wondered why she didn't intervene. He asked if he could ask her a question, to which she agreed. He asked why she wasn't approaching Cerberus, explaining that he believed she could easily surpass him. Persephone was stunned by this and explained that there were restrictions in place. The protagonist was confused and asked her to clarify, for Stephanie explained that Cerberus prevented lost spirits from entering the mortal world and outsiders who tried to enter out of curiosity. She then revealed that she was one of those lost spirits who wanted to return, as we observe. Our protagonist walks alongside Persephone and reflects on her limitations within the underworld. He notes that she is unable to do anything about Cerberus, and is only permitted to lay her hands on a select few beings that Hades allows, such as himself. Recalling the mythological story of how Hades kidnapped Persephone and imprisoned her in the underworld, the protagonist initially thought it was absurd, but now realizes it to be true. He empathizes with Persephone, imagining the immense amount of time she must have spent alone, and finds it rather sad. He decides to set aside his sense of justice, recognizing that Persephone's husband as Hades Zeus's brother, and contemplates what he could possibly do to help. His thoughts are interrupted by Snow, who seems upset. He apologizes for leaving her behind, and they continue on with the protagonist, now seen dragging Cerberus. He notices something different about the creature, prompting him to question what had gotten into him. For Stephanie explains that Cerberus's duty is to chase after the dead, and despite his intimidating appearance, he performs his job quite well. This also explains why she is unable to leave, as she is bound by her responsibilities. She goes on to say that once the protagonist chains Cerberus to the pillar, his morning duties will be complete. The protagonist had a thought about a dog guarding a goddess and wondered if Hades was overly cautious. As he was preparing to chain Cerberus to the pillar, his intuition kicked in and he sensed something inside. Curious, he punched through the pillar and revealed a collar, surprising Persephone. The protagonist then explained that he saw something interesting inside the system, then revealed that the collar was actually Cerberus' training collar, which Hades used to train him. When the collar was worn, Cerberus would obey all commands given to him, for Stephanie expressed surprise upon discovering the collar with the protagonist, and shared that she had searched for it unsuccessfully. She prodded the protagonist to explain how he found it, to which he replied that it was merely a hunch. The protagonist came to the realization that the collar was exceptional. Persephone confirmed this by explaining that Cerberus is a representation of the underworld, and whoever possesses the collar has authority over all of it. The protagonist objected to using it as it belonged to Hades, but Persephone reassured them by saying that it was not prohibited. She shared that her husband would frequently ask her to find the collar, promising to allow her to train Cerberus if she did. The protagonist eagerly seized the opportunity and ordered Cerberus to let him put the collar around his neck. Although Cerberus was hesitant at first, the protagonist ultimately overpowered him and issued several commands, which Cerberus obediently carried out. However, Persephone suddenly interrupted their interaction, charming the protagonist and rendering him helpless. She revealed that her husband had given Cerberus 2 final orders to monitor any attempts by the dead to escape the underworld and to keep an eye on her. As the protagonist succumbed to drowsiness, Persephone urged him to rest and assured him that she would return before her husband did. Despite his determination to resist, the protagonist could not resist the effects of Persephone's spell and drifted off to sleep. That's all for today's video. If you want to know what happened next, I will create a next part as soon as more chapters are available, so like and subscribe on aniplane YouTube channel.